When I arranged to visit NAL as part of my Australian trip in March to learn more about NL3 and COSI 2, I was really curious just how meaningful they would be. After all, NL2 has been the global benchmark for years, and COSI is a basic open-ended questionnaire to encourage clients to identify their hearing needs and how well they were met. What could they possibly do to update them? Little did I know what was in the fertile minds of the researchers at NAL. I was more than a little surprised, and I think you will be too. Kind thanks to Pádraig Kitterick for spending time with me and for being so open in exchange for airing this after their presentations at AAA and Audiology Australia. He made me feel right at home recording in the NAL library. Equal gratitude goes out to Justin Zakis and Matt Croteau for fitting me with a set of NL3 hearing aids to take home and try. I swear they were both reciting the real ear speech under their breath, they having done it so many times in the course of their trials. Stick around to the end where I share my impressions. Hello everyone, and welcome to This Week in Hearing from the National Acoustic Laboratories. I'm here with Pádraig Kitterick. He's the head of acoustic science, and we've got a couple of exciting things to discuss. The next level of NAL called NAL-NL3 and COSI 2.0. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So this is really exciting actually. Let's talk about NL3 first, because in my mind it's almost like a global standard fitting algorithm that's known and used worldwide. What could you possibly do different?
So if we take a step back and think about NAL-NL2, it's got lots of bells and whistles, lots of knobs you can turn, lots of parameters you can set, but it's really just one formula that fits everybody.
Yeah, so meaning regardless of circumstances, NL2's formula is running the same.
Exactly.
I mean, other than noise level, because gain is changing with the...
Exactly. So it changes the gain based on input level, so it's a nonlinear formula, but actually it's the same underpinning formula that's working the whole time. What we realized and what we've come to the conclusion is that one size no longer fits all. So when we think about NL2, when we're updating that, we're saying that philosophy at the core of that, which is to maximize intelligibility of speech in quiet, but don't make it too loud. So don't exceed the loudness that a person with normal hearing might perceive. So that's the core philosophy, we call it. We're retaining that for our speech in quiet formula for NL3. What we realized is that there are needs out there where that philosophy breaks down. It no longer provides the best solution. And so we're going to start introducing new formulae that will go alongside the speech in quiet formula that we will introduce and we'll call modules. And we'll keep adding to those modules over time. So I guess to answer your question, there's sort of two key things. One is we're looking at the core speech in quiet formula, and we're going to address some sort of curly cases there, some sharp edges that we want it to be even easier to use and to deliver that core philosophy of maximizing benefit for speech in quiet even more. But then there's also when we got to introduce something brand new, where we're actually changing the philosophy to meet completely unmet needs that we believe all current hearing aid formulas for providing or prescribing gain and compression don't really provide an answer for, and I'm happy to come on and talk about some of that.
Okay, so when you talk about speech in quiet, like we're here right now in this beautiful setting, right? NL2 and NL3 will look very similar. A little bit of refinements, but basically similar in how the nonlinear gain is applied.
Absolutely. So we're sticking with what works well, what has been widely validated. And so when you prescribe gain for quiet with NL3, it will look quite similar, but there's some important changes that will be applied in certain cases. So when we went out to clinicians around the world and we said, hey, where does NAL-NL2 run into problems for you? Where is it not the best solution? We got some very, very consistent feedback. So one of the bits of feedback was for mixed losses. So people often report that the amount of gain that NL2 prescribes is too high to be tolerable by the individual when it comes to mixed losses.
Okay.
And so we've gone back and we've looked at that, and we've looked again at how do we account for the conductive component and prescribe gain for the sensory neural component, and we've come up with a better balance that better reflects what we think is going to be necessary to achieve a good, acceptable.
Okay. So you'll actually then you'll have base NL3.
Yep.
There'll be another version for people with mixed losses.
Well, actually for NL3, when you prescribe or when you add or input the sensory neural and then the air conduction thresholds and the bone conduction thresholds, it will automatically apply a refined approach to mixed losses. It's not a radical change, but there were just some things about how NL2 calculated how much additional gain it needs because it's a mixed loss that we've just refined that calculation, and it provides a much more achievable gain profile. In particular, for example, NL2 would ask for a lot of gain for conductive losses at very low frequencies and very high frequencies that would be difficult to achieve and not very acceptable to the end user. And so one of the things we've also done there is we've looked at huge numbers of fittings. So we have a lot of data on how NL2 is used in the clinic, and we can see in the data that clinicians are not prescribing the amount of gain in mixed losses that NL2 asked for. They're somewhere in between what NL2 asked for and what you would give for the sensory neural loss.
This is actually a key point, right? Because you actually took somebody who fitted a person with mixed losses. Then, as they worked with that client, they were actually adjusting the gain to maximize the client's satisfaction, and you've captured that data and baked it into NL3 for mixed losses.
That's absolutely correct. And we've done a similar thing across the board with high frequency gain. So a lot of the feedback we also got was that NL2 prescribes a lot of high frequency gain, particularly for new hearing aid users. Often people are fine-tuning to reduce that amount of gain. And so rather than just say, okay, we'll just reduce high frequency gain, we looked at what people are doing in the clinic. So again, we have hundreds of thousands of fittings we can look at. But then we went back and we said, okay, we want to reduce that high frequency gain where it's not adding meaningfully to intelligibility. So it's not just going in and turning down the gain, it's going in and saying, let's find a way to reduce the gain in a sensible way where we can still say that the solution is going to maximize intelligibility, but will not add excessive high frequency gain where it's not
more
really
comfortable and just as intelligible.
Exactly. And then the final big change or pain point that we've addressed with NL3 is reverse sloping losses. So again, this was a common sort of report from clinicians that they would often find with reverse sloping losses that NL2 was asking for far too much gain in low frequencies and far too little gain.
Conductive or mixed losses, right?
Exactly. So very similar reports. And so again, we went back, we looked at thousands of clinical cases where we could see how it was really fit. And then we were able to go back and think about the rationale and refine the formula so it would give a much more acceptable fit.
And this is all baked into the fitting software, so based on the nature of the hearing loss, you'll get the gain profile.
That's exactly right. And it was funny, I could talk to an audiologist in the United States, or in the Netherlands, or in Australia, or in any part of the world, and I would almost invariably get those same 3 or 4 different cases that they would sort of note that NL2 would give them something suboptimal.
Which is interesting. That's also language dependent. For example, the same, as you make these tweaks, you're not having problems with more tonal languages, for example, or languages with clicking sounds or what have you, that it actually works globally.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, one of the really big bits of feedback we did get is the importance of retaining our tonal formula, for example, as part of the solution, because people really valued the fact that there was a way to optimize fits for people who use tonal languages. So that is something that we'll retain in NL3. I guess one other thing to mention is that NL2 is ultimately an algorithm. It is based on science, where the authors, even over 10 years ago, were using quite advanced computational technology to take models of speech intelligibility. But that process, of course, you can imagine in the past over 10 years, the technology that we have available to solve that problem, to take these very nonlinear, complicated models of these perceptual processes of intelligibility and loudness, we've now got fantastic technology that gives us a really advanced tools. So we've brought some up-to-date technology into solving that problem. Now, that does not radically, often in many cases, change the gain profile, but sometimes it does. In fact, sometimes what we find is that the new technology that we're using to solve that, what we call the optimization problem, how do you maximize intelligibility and not exceed a certain loudness level, we actually find that the answers that our more modern technology gives are more similar to the kinds of things that clinicians are fitting in the clinic.
Well, this is almost an application for AI, really, right? Because you're using the clinician results as a training model for the new version of the algorithm.
That's absolutely right. And we're using something called reinforcement learning, which is a technology that people will have heard of that's now being widely used to solve very complex problems. Google and DeepMind have applied that to teach computers how to play Go and chess and all sorts of complicated things. It's used by many industries to solve very many complicated problems, and we're now applying reinforcement to the problem of solving various different challenges that we have. So in this case, maximizing intelligibility models while achieving certain loudness targets. And so that's part of the difference that comes with NL3, is that we're now switching to this much more newer technology. But we're learning from what really is achievable in the clinic. So gain that is achievable in the real world, but yet still maximizes intelligibility. And so we're baking all of that into the core formula.
Well, we've been talking about core NL3 at this point. But tell me about modules. What are modules for?
So when we think about the core of NL3, sort of what you might think of as the drop-in replacement for NL2, right? It's based on that philosophy that I've mentioned a few times, maximizing intelligibility, not exceeding normal loudness.
In quiet.
And so the way we think about modules in NL3 is where a use case or a population needs a different philosophy for how you fit, then we're going to make that formula a new module.
And what are those populations?
So for the first release of NL3, which will come later this year in 2025, we focused on what we think are the top 2 things that we get told again and again and again. The first one is people with minimal or no audiometric hearing loss. And the second one is about listening in noisy environments. So we know that on both accounts, more and more people are willing to consider hearing aid technology, even when they have minimal or no audiometric hearing loss. And there's an increasing recognition that people can experience hearing difficulties, even if clinically we might measure a normal or a near normal audio.
You know, I have to cite Brent Edwards, right? And it's 25 million Americans who have no audiometric hearing loss, but difficulty understanding speech, particularly in noise. And if you take that, that's 25 million Americans. We have about 5% of the global population. Multiply that out and you have 500 million people in that position.
Yeah, and when I think of Brent's seminal paper where he shows 4 quadrants based on whether people have an audiometric hearing loss or what we might think of as a clinically diagnosed hearing loss.
That's so many times.
And then the other dimension being, do they actually report having a difficulty? We focus on the people who have a hearing loss, almost irrespective of whether they say they have a difficulty or not, or they think they do. But there's a large population, as you're alluding to, of people who don't have a hearing loss or a clinical, sort of classically defined hearing loss, audiometric hearing loss.
Right.
But who report significant problems with speech and noise in particular. And so then the question is, we have done a whole sort of many years of research at NAL where we have taken hearing aids and we have fit these individuals with hearing aids and shown again and again that they benefit. But what a lot of clinicians who've read that research, who's heard Brent talk at conferences, says, okay, but that's all well and good, but I've got a client in front of me, how do I fit them? Because if I choose NAL-NL2, it just says 0 gain across the board.
So I'm assuming you're really just relying on the directional microphones then to deliver a little extra SNR. So you're paying thousands of dollars for a directional microphone, essentially.
Well, that's it. But also, from a sort of conventional clinician sort of training perspective, you think, well, the milder the loss, the more open you also want the fitting to be, because people don't want their ears occluded. So it's not just that. It's also that they're only really getting information from the hearing aid at a very narrow restricted frequency range. So people tend to report the hearing aids as sounding tinny, so they don't really like the sound quality. And so we've really stepped back from this and thought, okay, what have we got to solve this problem? We have these hearing aids that are very miniature devices. They are sophisticated signal processing devices. They could potentially give you a broad bandwidth, cleaned up signal with advanced noise reduction algorithms. Major manufacturers now introducing a deep neural network based speech enhancement or noise reduction.
You'll only get all this if you run an occluded fitting.
Exactly. So will people accept that? That's a question I'm sure that many clinicians would have. The assumption will be that people would not accept a more occluding fitting. And I think they're right if you're talking about quiet environments, but we're here focused on where people say they have the difficulty, which is in noise. And it turns out that in noise, issues with your own voice are a lot less of a problem. Right? For probably reasons that are fairly obvious.
Well, I'll say yes and no, because like when I've tested a lot of devices, including a lot of consumer devices that go full occluding, my very first test is to start chewing my food and see if I could still hear the person across the table. If I cannot, I am done. I'm done right there.
Absolutely. So it's all about a trade-off, right? If you went to a fully occluding fitting, chewing, swallowing, all of those things become a really big problem. And when we're talking about really noisy situations that often involve eating and drinking and talking, then you've got to balance that. So consequently, we're focused on fittings that are semi-occluding, that you wouldn't go right to a full occluding fitting, right? But use a semi-occluding fitting so that you're still allowing that direct path at the low frequencies, so you don't get as big an issue with things like chewing and swallowing.
And you're not providing so much gain that it gets uncomfortable, but you're boosting the SNR.
Exactly, and that's the challenge. It's a trade-off. You have to provide people a big enough speech benefit, one, for them to notice, and two, for them to be willing to tolerate wearing hearing aids and listening to that gain. Because we all know that, it is going to be a trade-off in these individuals. They have normal hearing, so acoustically speaking, they don't need amplification. So we are trying to give them the cleaned up signal from the hearing aid and do that in a way that still does not compromise speech quality, the naturalness of speech, the comfortableness of the environment around them, chewing, swallowing their own voice. So it's a real balancing act, and that's ultimately what we focused on creating.
Well, this is really just one more level of convergence between consumer devices and hearing devices, because ultimately this is a great argument for situational devices.
Yes.
If I go in and I'm prescribed a prescription hearing aid, I'm resistant to wearing it in quiet situations because I don't need it. But if you go with, say, an 8-hour earbud running that module of NL3, you can also do more, because you're only running an 8-hour device. You can do active occlusion reduction, for example, right? There are all kinds of things you can do in an earbud that a person's going to pop in their ear and go to a restaurant, but not going to wear all day.
Absolutely, and when we talk about our minimum hearing loss module, it really is for that situational use. We do expect that, as device manufacturers integrate this module into their devices, then I'm sure that they will be thinking, okay, how do you really optimize a device for this use case? Will it transition to a transparency mode for quiet if you want to use it, or is it just used for noise? I mean, this I hope we will see, and I expect we'll see a lot of innovation around this. But I think the benefit from a sort of a clinical and a service provider perspective is also that, this isn't a one-size-fits-all either, right? This is a prescription that can also adapt to the person's hearing loss. So often you don't have somebody with completely normal hearing. You might have somebody with thresholds within normal hearing up to maybe 3K, but then they start to have some high-frequency hearing loss. So what do you do then? So one of the other benefits of our formula approach is that it will automatically mix and match and merge together sort of what we call a hybrid approach, where they need gain for peripheral compensation because maybe they've got some high frequency loss, we'll prescribe that gain. But then at the lower frequencies where they don't need that gain, we have that balance between comfort and access to the hearing aid signal. So this is not something where if they're not normal hearing perfectly, you can't use it. It's something that actually gradually adapts and ultimately at the extreme starts to look more like our core module.
Okay. And then we've been talking about people without audiometric hearing loss in noise. What about people with audiometric hearing loss in noise?
So that's where our noise module comes in. So obviously we have our existing speech and quiet solution, and that spans from people with a mild loss all the way to people with a profound loss. And we looked at that and we said, okay, generally speaking, what we know is that manufacturers have put a huge amount of investment in hearing aids in managing noise, because the world is a noisy place, because communication often matters more when you're in noise, right? It's when you're socializing. It's when, you know, you really want to hear what's said, you want to be part of the group conversation. And so actually that's where the hearing aid is really, really critical for a lot of people.
That's the key functionality of hearing aids, right? Is you don't want people to socially isolate themselves.
Absolutely. And so in that case, we ask the question to ourselves, is our speech in quiet formula actually the most fitting solution for that use case? And the answer is no, we believe. Why? Because it assumes that all of the speech signal is perfectly audible. But of course, in a noisy situation, that isn't the case. So in a noisy situation, let's assume typically we're at maybe a +6 dB signal to noise ratio in a noisy restaurant, hopefully. We know that's a typical signal to noise ratio you get in many ecologically valid sort of real world situations. So a lot of the speech cues are also being masked by the noise. So what we looked at that and we said, okay, well maybe there's a compromise we can make here. Maybe actually we can reduce the loudness, the perceived loudness of the signal without compromising the intelligibility of the signal. So as you reduce the loudness of the signal, there will come a point where the signal itself dips below the threshold that you can hear the signal. But actually at positive signal to noise ratios, you can actually reduce loudness quite a bit before any audible bit of the speech signal really starts to become inaudible. And so we looked at that because of course we can't change the signal to noise ratio by twiddling the gains and the compression. You know, that requires directional microphones, noise reduction, and the hearing aid manufacturers, they're the experts there, they're advancing the technology there. But even the best technology will still get you to a slightly more favorable signal to noise ratio. It doesn't put you in a speech in quiet, right? There's always background noise. And what hearing aid users often say is, well, I don't want the noise to go away. I still want to feel like I'm in the ambience. I still want to have situational awareness.
Very much so, yes.
Right? So we're dealing with a situation where you've got a positive signal to noise ratio, but the noise is still being amplified, and we're still prescribing gain based on the assumption you're in quiet. So what we do in our noise module is to, again, to have a balance. We want to make it more comfortable. How do we do that? We make it less loud. The challenge is, how do you make it less loud perceptually while maintaining the intelligibility? And that's what our noise module does.
It makes it as intelligible but more comfortable.
That's absolutely correct.
So how do you know this works?
Good question. So for both modules, we've been running studies in-house at NAL now for some time. And we have a fantastic team of audiologists, engineers, machine learning and AI specialists right across the board who have been absolutely focused. Almost every single person at NAL has been focused on helping with this, making sure that NL3 is the best solution that we have. And so I'll just maybe talk you through some of the studies that we've been running. So let me start with what we were just talking about, listening in noise. So we've had over 40 people come in, and they have been existing hearing aid users. Even just in the past 4 to 6 weeks, we've had them come in, for example, and try the very latest formula that we've been developing. We fit them with the existing formula, and we fit them with our new noise module, right? And we're always comparing to our existing sort of NL3 speech in quiet.
Is this double blind? I mean, do they know what they're getting?
So participants don't know what they're getting.
Okay.
And so when we put them in the lab,
so I guess single blind, right?
So they're single blind. So the audiologists will program, and we will do speech and noise testing in the lab. So we will measure how many words they're getting correct, and we'll put them in a very noisy 80 dB babble. We'll put them in a
You're using your chamber for this.
Absolutely. We've got an array of loudspeaker. We'll actually put them in some realistic background noises as well. So we're testing across multiple different background noises, multiple different noise levels, and we're measuring actually how many words they repeat correctly in a more conventional laboratory-based task. And with and without our noise formula, we see no significant change at all in their speech intelligibility. So intelligibility is maintained.
How are you rating comfort though? How are you getting feedback? Is it more comfortable? Because if it isn't more comfortable, then what's the point?
Absolutely. Our test is if you send people out in the real world and you get them to go into the noisy places that they want to listen, which do they prefer to listen with?
No, don't make me go to a bar on the rocks tonight to try this out.
So that's ultimately the real world test. It's got to pass the real world test. So what we do is we send our participants away with hearing aids from all 5 major manufacturers. So we've included devices from all major manufacturers in these trials. This isn't any particular device. We set those devices up to be in their best performance. We give them the latest technology. If it's got bells and whistles for listening, everything's turned on. But we give them 2 programs. One program is programmed with the new noise module. The other program is programmed with NL3 core.
So they can switch between the programs at their leisure.
That's absolutely correct. But they don't know which one is the new or the older quiet formula. They've just got program 1, program 2, we call them, right?
Yeah.
And they have a phone app. That's our ecological momentary assessment app. Basically, it's a smart name for a phone app that allows them in a situation to just tell us quickly, okay, which should you prefer in terms of loudness, comfort, sound quality, naturalness, and ultimately what we care about is which one would you prefer to use in this situation?
They're rating it on the spot. They're not recalling afterwards. No. They're in the cafe.
They're in the cafe and they're doing it
their
there
choices.
And then. Yep. So the other thing is that our phone app actually is able to record the sound level. So we can also look at their ratings when they're in extremely noisy environments. So for example, 75, 80 or above
So wait a minute,
dB.
you're actually dynamically capturing the ambient noise level while they're testing and giving their feedback.
That's correct. We can actually look at the sort of A-weighted sound level when they're in that environment. And what we see is that in those noisy environments, almost 70% of people are choosing and saying, no, I prefer the noise module.
And what about the other 30? Are they preferring the other one, or is it more of a toss-up?
It's more of a toss-up.
So you have a smaller percentage of people like, either way, and most people are saying the new module is better.
Yeah, and that's for us the most important thing, right? We can show what we want in the lab, and that is important, and we want to collect the evidence. And for us, being able to do the intelligibility testing in the lab and to actually show empirically that intelligibility is not significantly different. I think that the average speech scores were within like a percentage point or 2, like they're basically identical. But if you looked at the gains as a clinician, you might be surprised. We're really reducing down the gain. But as we'll show when we publish this data, actually we're really only making, probably only making very small parts of the speech signal unintelligible or not audible, because a lot of it is masked out by the noise. And so in noise, we have a lot more latitude to reduce loudness. And so we believe that we've got a really good pragmatic solution.
Excellent. And when will the papers be published, and when will NL3 hit the marketplace?
Right, so really good question. So we've been working on NL3 studies since last year. We've been gathering more and more evidence, and we really want this to have a really sound foundational evidence. So when we come back from the American Academy of Audiology, which is happening in 2 weeks' time, their conference, and the Audiology Australia conference, which is happening immediately afterwards. Where
just a little bit too long. I would have stayed for it if it wasn't another couple of weeks, right?
We would have loved to have you here for that. So we'll be presenting at those 2 major conferences, showing the results from what the studies we've done so far. And when we land back in Sydney then in early April, we'll be wrapping those studies up. We'll be asking ourselves the question, is there any more evidence that we need? And then we'll be sitting down and writing those papers. So we expect that those papers, subject to the typical peer review process, will be coming out in the next few months. So we'll be wanting to get them out very soon into journals. And then our timeline for the actual release of the product is that we've been working very closely with hearing aid manufacturers and manufacturers of verification equipment. So the kind of vendors that integrate NL2 and our sort of prescription formulas into their software. We'll be having advanced versions, so beta versions of those to them in a few months' time. We expect to give them the very final sort of release to manufacturer in September. And so we hope then that as they release and update their fitting softwares and their verification softwares, after that point, you'll start to see an NL3 option available to you.
And that's ultimately, I didn't express it quite so, but that was what I was wondering, when manufacturers would have access to it. And you're saying really September timeframe.
Yeah, September is when they'll get the final product, but we also want to give it to them. So as soon as we have an early beta, which will be a few months before that, we'll be sharing that with them, making sure that we can work with them as a key partner to ease the integration of this new technology so that hopefully we can get it in the hands of clinicians as quickly as possible.
Oh, excellent. This is really exciting because I personally thought NL2 was like the end of it all, right? But the fact is that you're now able to develop optimization for different situations. I think is going to be really beneficial for people, including me, who probably has more difficulty in noisy situations out of proportion to his actual hearing loss.
Yeah.
Just looking forward to anything that makes, and there are a lot of people in that same camp, right? And so
absolutely, there's a huge amount. I mean, we looked at the statistics even here in Australia. We worked with a couple of different hearing service providers actually, and we came up with an estimate of anywhere between 40 and even maybe as high as 60% of new adult clients who were walking in clinic doors had hearing loss that was either very minimal or within the normal hearing range. And a majority of those clients were reporting significant hearing problems if we use something, let's say, like the HHIE or one of those sort of standard questionnaires. Mm-hmm. So that's why also we put a big focus on that minimum hearing module.
That's all really exciting stuff. And it's funny you mentioned HAIE. Let's touch on COSI 2.0, right? Because after getting fitted with this, you might ask somebody to fill out the COSI, right? So the COSI is a very basic questionnaire that gets to the root of a person's actual experience. Like, what have you done with COSI 2.0 that makes it different?
So, if we go back to what COSI was all about, right? It was about putting the client at the center of their care. Right? We talk about client-centered care or patient-centered care. You start off with what the needs of the client are, and then you try to identify the appropriate solutions, the rehabilitation that they need. And then the key thing with COSI is it was all about judging the success of the treatment.
And it was very open-ended, which makes me wonder how you can improve it.
Absolutely. So when we talk to clinicians about COSI, it has some downsides. One, it's quite a general open framework, right? It's very open. If you look at the original COSI form, it's really more just get the client to write down situations that are important to them, and then you rate whether or not that situation has improved, okay? Simple concept. Hard to execute though when you might have clients who struggle to think about what are the situations that are really important to me? Because maybe I've turned up to the clinic because maybe my partner has thought it's about time you go get your ears checked, and maybe, sick of you turning up the TV too loud, or has noticed that you're not socializing as much or as long with your friends, but maybe that's not so obvious to you. Yeah. And the first time you're being asked to think about this is when you're in the clinic and all of a sudden you're sitting in front of the audiologist and say, right, so what's the problem I can solve?
Okay, no, right? I totally get it, right? You need time to reflect on it.
Absolutely. And the other key challenge is for the clinician. You maybe have 45 minutes to an hour, maybe you're in the luxury of having longer, right? But a lot of clinicians, they do not have longer than that, right?
Right.
And you've got a lot to get through at an assessment appointment. Not only have you got to find out what their needs are, you've got to find out, you've got to do all of the diagnostic testing. You've got to explain all those results to the client. You've then got to think about what solution might actually address the client needs. You've got to then explain that to them and try to decide what the next step is. So that's a lot to fit in. And you're trying to do all of that while being incredibly client-centered and think about a variety of different, a variety of different levels of access to information. So you're giving a lot of information to the client. Some clients will soak that up like a sponge. Other clients, you might need to take more time explaining those things. Not to mention if you're dealing with non-native English speakers, for example, or non-native in the language that you're practicing.
Well, yeah, this must be really difficult when you're working, for example, as Hearing Australia does with Aboriginal populations or people who live on the Torres Strait Islands, right?
I mean,
providing... And this has global implications too in underserved areas.
Absolutely, so there's the challenge of providing culturally safe services and adapting everything to no matter what population you're dealing with, so they feel safe and secure and comfortable to talk about those needs, but also that you can make this relevant, right? So if you truly want to make a service client-centered, you can't have the client put in the center of that on the spot from the first time they walk in, and they're not prepared for that. Now, that's a hard problem to solve, and many service providers would say they can send out information in advance, they can try to engage the client. It's a real challenge. So we looked at that and said, okay, how can we make the client even more centered in this whole process? Ultimately, you ideally want the clinician and the client to be talking about the client's needs as soon as they walk in that appointment, but also the clinician already understands the client's needs in the client's own voice, right? Because that's really important too.
And so how do you get there?
So what we're doing is we're leveraging AI technology, which everybody is, of course, but we looked at sort of large language models and we thought, the beauty of this is not that we can replace the clinician, because we don't want to do that. We want to try to have the client to have a more naturalistic way of reflecting on what their needs are, right? And talking to somebody with natural language is a relatively, it's a naturalistic, it feels quite natural, particularly if you're not just sort of put in front of a bot of some kind. You're trying to undertake a task. And we're also able to train that artificial intelligence so that it's able to ask the right questions. And so it's able to actually go back to the client and said, okay, I've asked you some questions. I think the needs that you're describing are as follows. Is that correct?
And this would take place before the visit.
Exactly. And so the point is, it's a time that the client can reflect on what their needs are. So what we've done is we've trained this very sophisticated AI model. We call it a multi-agent model, but basically we've got multiple different parts of this system. Some of that part of the system has been trained on millions of client-clinician interactions discussing goals, right, and discussing needs.
And I think this is really important because people who think about AI thinking about large language models where the internet was the input.
Exactly.
Right? And of course, these models are unable to determine what's satire, what's truth, what's an outright lie, which is how you end up with being told to put glue on your pizza to keep the cheese from sliding off. But when you control the training input, then the output is much more reliable.
Yeah.
So your training data are real interactions.
Yes. I mean, you can say, forget AI being artificial intelligence, think of it as audiological intelligence, right? We want to put in important information that is actually relevant and useful for this kind of interaction. So that comes from millions of client-clinician interactions around the original COSI, where we can see what are the kinds of things that clients actually want and need. What are the kinds of things also that tend to improve over time when somebody gets audiological intervention, right? Because sometimes people might write down a need that's very difficult to change or improve through audiological intervention, but we want to focus on the needs that will change, because that's the kind of need that we think we want to be able to focus on and the clinician wants to be able to focus on. So we have all of that. We've also got the kind of language and terminology that clients typically use. So what we've done is we've brought that knowledge together, plus we've thought about what kind of information we need to capture through a discussion. So the COSI would say, hey, what's the situation, right? But with COSI 2, it's not just the situation, it's why. Why do you want to improve in that situation? Like what is it about? It's not just about understanding more speech and noise. It could be about not feeling left out of the conversation. So we're thinking carefully about what questions that we should ask the client, and we've trained this system so that when the client talks to it, then what it gives back to them is it reflects back, hey, I've been listening to you, I think your needs are the following.
So you've created a reflective listening system.
Exactly.
And this is done verbally, correct?
So this is done actually through a web-based system. It's very simple to use. So people simply get asked a question and they type in their response.
Okay, so they're typing the responses.
They're typing in the response.
A verbal conversation.
I think that will come too, because obviously we see with OpenAI, these sort of natural interactions are becoming easier and easier. We started off.
That's COSI 3.0, right?
Yeah,
COSI 2.0, you're interacting by typing.
You're interacting by typing, and you could do it on your phone or at a computer. And of course, we had questions, right? First question is, will people interact with this? Will they want to say anything to this, right? Will people
have
type
this conversation typing into a machine?
Exactly. And so we had all the same questions that I'm sure your listeners and your watchers, your viewers are also thinking about now. So at the moment, we've been running studies with COSI 2 where when a client books in, we've been working with some clinics locally here who are really innovative in their practice, and they say, hey, we want to introduce this to our clients. We're willing to try to test this out. So when their clients get booked in for an assessment, we intervene and we say, hey, your assessment's coming up. Here's a link, fill it out. We get a huge number of those clients, typically if you send a client out something in advance, maybe anywhere between 10%, but maybe more like 1% of clients will do something with that information, right? It's really hard to get people to engage.
Yes.
So we're getting more like between 40 and 60% of those clients, and they don't know anything about this, right? They're not primed, they're not selected clients, they're just anybody who's booked in for an assessment.
And they're just basically told, this will help improve your experience and get you off and running in a better state if you answer these questions first.
So we're getting
and they're doing it.
And they're doing it. More than half the people are doing it. When they do it, they're actually really engaging with it. They're answering the prompts really thoughtfully. They're telling the system about multiple needs. So it goes through one need and then asks you if you have any more, and they keep going. And they're also not just typing one-word answers. Like, they're doing this in the privacy of their own home. They're typing in really sort of thoughtful, reflective information, and we ask them once they've done...
Which is so valuable in itself, actually. The first time they've probably been thoughtful and reflective on exactly what their hearing needs are.
Yeah, and it gives them that time. I mean, maybe they click on the link and they think, oh, I'll have to think about this, but they have the time to do it. That's the key thing. And what we do immediately after they do it is we say, hey, how good were those needs? So it told you some needs. How much do you trust those? How much do they actually reflect? And we see that the overwhelming feedback is that they really do reflect what the client thought was their own needs.
And then do you run an after COSI so you get the improvement scores?
Yeah, so that's what we're running at the moment. So we don't have data on that yet because we've actually been running COSI 2 since just when we came back in January. We haven't enough time for the new version. But what we have been doing is we've been asking the clinician. So when the client fills in that in advance, that gets then sent to the clinician. So then when the client walks in to the assessment appointment, the clinician already has a set of needs based on what the client thought it was.
Sure, that would be the whole goal of doing it.
That's the whole goal, right? So we ask the clinician things like, did that save you time, first of all? Did that help you have a better conversation, a deeper, more meaningful conversation with the client? And actually, did that enhance things like the discussion around technology? Because you could already think, okay, what is this client looking for? What are the kinds of needs? What kind of technology might they? And across the board, again, we see really positive feedback from the clinicians. They're thinking that, yes, it's great. They're coming in. I'm able to immediately start a conversation. We're able to have a deeper, more meaningful conversation. One of the things that really surprised us, though, was some of the feedback from the clinicians. It was actually to do with the kind of language and words and topics that the clients had identified in advance. So clinicians said things like, actually, we're having conversations that are more about why it's meaningful to them, the emotional side of things, the sort of social side of the need that they have, because they raised it in their needs assessment. And so I don't feel like I'm raising a topic that might be a bit embarrassing or sensitive to talk about.
Yeah,
like
they don't know where the emotional landmines are, but once you've gone through COSI 2.0, or the client has, you've cleared those landmines.
Absolutely, because the client has come up with a need that says, I'm feeling isolated, I'm feeling lonely because I'm not able to talk in noise. Then the clinician can engage with that in the appointment, and they feel like they can engage with that because it's safe to do so because the client has put that forward.
Right, because you have almost the opposite risk where the clinician is afraid to bring up what might be sensitive topics when in fact the client actually wants to talk about them.
That's exactly right. So the early data is very encouraging. So we get really good engagement from the clients, really positive feedback from the clinicians. It seems to be, and our goal here is to enhance the quality of that conversation, right? That's what it's all about. It's about making sure that conversation with the client at assessment is really more about the client needs and as centered on the client needs as possible. And ultimately that should give us better outcomes. What we're seeing at the moment is that those who go through that process seem to be more likely to go on and accept and take up hearing technology. That's an early signal we're seeing in the data. Compared to those who don't do it, fewer of them take up technology. And so we're really interested in understanding, why is that and who are those individuals and what is it about the tool that might have helped with that. Ultimately, what we're looking forward to, and we'll be getting this data back in end of March, beginning of April, is the outcome data. So the next part of this tool is that it gets the client to self-reflect on how their experience has changed outside of the clinic They're not doing it in front of the clinician. They don't need to say nice things just because they don't want to offend the clinician.
Yeah, after some period of time, they can then, this is where you get to the part of the original COSI, well, how much improvement have I seen?
Absolutely, right? And so we can, again, put that in their hands. We can make that a naturalistic interaction, and we can get them thinking about that. And we can also remind them and say, hey, 2 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, whenever it was, you said that these were your needs. These were the things that you wanted. This is your language, not ours. You know, how are you going with that? What's changed? Has it changed?
And so when will COSI 2 actually be available for clinicians?
That's a really good question. We don't yet have a timeline. We're at the really early stage of proving this technology for us. You know, we want really solid evidence. We want to be convinced ourselves. The early data looks really compelling, and we'll be presenting some of that data at the 2 conferences that I mentioned earlier, both in America and in Australia in the coming weeks.
And then there'll be published papers following.
There'll be published papers following that, and then we're looking at technology partners. Who could we partner with this to actually start getting this rolled out in bigger trials, in different populations?
Yeah, so you roll it out with field trials with a clinic or, you know, larger practices, and then...
Yeah, and we're looking at different models as well. So obviously you've got what we're doing at the moment is testing the traditional clinic-based model, where the client gets sent something in advance but then does come into the clinic. We're interested in its use in remote care models, where clients would still interact with the clinician but via some sort of video chat. So how could it fit into that? And what about self-fitting models and self-care models, where the client doesn't talk to a clinician at all? Could this be a really valuable, could it still play a valuable role in there? Because it's all about helping the client self-reflect about what they want. So we're looking at all of these different potential use cases, but we're starting with that more sort of traditional clinical model, because we're aware that there's lots of people out there using COSI today. And, you know, if we're convinced by the evidence, and the early evidence looks fantastic so far, then again, our goal, just like NL3, is getting it into the hands of clinicians as quickly as we can.
And I think that's great, right? Because an informed client is a client with a greater chance of walking away happy.
Yep.
After the clinic visit.
Yeah. And we always say that when it comes to their needs and to technology, and some of our previous research around how do you explain technology to people with hearing loss, and the great work that people like yourself and others do at trying to convey and communicate all these complicated technologies, we would love every client to be as opinionated as possible, as we are about our smartphones, as we are about our cars. We would love a client to walk in clear and mindful and thoughtful about their needs and what they need, and opinionated about what technologies of all the great things out there they want and they want to listen to and they want to try out. So that ultimately we want somebody who comes forward to get the right solution for them and to have a successful outcome. That's the thing that's going to have people keeping engaging with their hearing health, keep going, and then as they age, as their needs change, as the technology they need changes, they'll keep engaged with it, just as we keep engaged with our general practitioner or our physician about all sorts of other aspects of our health.
That's just a really great summary, and you know how NL3 and COSI 2 are going to bring that about. I'm really looking forward to seeing it roll out, and what the feedback and the outcomes are as both of those become deployed. So thanks a lot. I really appreciate you explaining it. Very exciting stuff.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. It really helped put NL3 in context by trying out a set of hearing aids programmed with it. Justin and Matt set me up with a pair of ReSound Omnia 9s, which included 2 speech and noise programs. One was programmed with base NL3, which would be similar to NL2 with my hearing loss. The other was with the new noise module. Both had the other Omnia speech and noise features turned on. I didn't know which program was which. On 3 separate occasions, all noisy and all with different companions, I alternated between both. The characteristics of each were considerably different and at first misleading. However, I quickly figured out which was which. One mode sounded normal, which for a 2-generation-old hearing aid, it included a bit of harshness, which I tend to think of as chirpy when all the noise features are engaged. The other sounded like the volume was turned down a couple of clicks. The temptation was to think the normal one must be the new noise module boosting the speech. But with a bit of listening, I realized that even if the sound scene was quieter and less harsh in the other program, I could understand my companions just as well. I had it figured out, and Pádraig confirmed. It was interesting to spend a couple of minutes without any hearing aids in my ears. It was quite comfortable to listen that way, though of course intelligibility went way down. When I popped the Omnias back in, while in what I assumed was the noise module, the comfort pretty much remained, but the intelligibility went up. When I switched modes, the intelligibility remained, but the sound was harsher. It may have been an unfair comparison, but on the last evening I swapped in a set of newer resounds, the Vivias. Of course the Vivias performed better overall, but I was looking at relative comfort. In that respect, the Vivias bested the Omnias with the NL3 noise module, but not by much. My conclusion was that resound addressed comfort by other means. It made me wonder if NL's 3 noise module would bring even further benefits. It also made me wonder if the greatest improvement would be delivered in mid-grade hearing aids and OTC which don't have the latest DNNs and such. That remains to be seen. But this I can say, at least for me and my hearing loss, mission accomplished, NAL.